Section 12 of The White Heart of Mojave by Edna Perkins. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Sue Anderson. Hardly had we unpacked the wagon and made a fireplace before we noticed that the wind was increasing. Little whirligigs of sand began to run across the valley. Soon they were charging at us down the mesa. First they came singly, then merged into a cloud of sand that rattled against the pots and the wagon. Luckily for us, the wind was blowing from the mountains over the mesa, where there was comparatively little sand to pick up, for had it been coming across the dunes, we would have been buried alive. Of course, it was impossible to cook. In a very few minutes it was impossible to do anything but crouch in the lee of the sand heap around the roots of the biggest mesquite. The Worrier seemed to shrink up and draw in his head like a turtle. He shouted something at us, of which we could only hear the word hunch. The air was full of a rushing, hissing sound. Charlotte and I covered ourselves with the ponchos, drawing them over our heads when the sand came hurtling through the top of the mesquite. Molly and Bill huddled close together about 50 feet away, with their backs to the blast, and much of the time the sand was so dense that we could not see them. The Worrier also was lost in the yellow cloud. The sand was very fine, and in spite of the ponchos, sifted into our hair and ears and clothes. It gritted in our teeth, so we felt as though we were eating it. We could see it piling up around the next mesquite, and could imagine it whirling through the valley over the tops of old Johnny's dunes. Often the wind goes down at sunset, but that day the sun sank invisibly and the fury increased. We felt a queer excitement not unmixed with fear. Thus only 100 times worse must the sand blow over the vast Sahara Desert while the Arabs cover their heads calling on Allah. When the solid ground itself arises, there is no help but Allah. After sunset the Worrier emerged again from the flying yellow mass. His shirt was blown tight to him and the loose sleeves whipped in the wind. He leaned against it, bending forward. He shouted that we might possibly get some shelter by continuing along the road toward Salt Creek, where it winds further around the side of Sheep Mountain. He advised us to move, because if the storm continued, he could not keep Molly and Bill. "Tie them up," we yelled. "Can't. Go crazy." Then, as we did not move, his voice rose peremptorily. "Come on. If it gets worse, we can't go." We had disregarded his first hunch. Now, if he had another, far be it from us to raise difficulties, though we could hardly see how it was possible to travel even then. Charlotte and I staggered up from the mesquite, and all three of us packed as speedily as we could. It was a disorderly packing, as we could scarcely stand before the wind and were almost blinded by the sand. Molly and Bill were wild with excitement. I remember vividly bracing myself against the wall of wind, holding on to Molly, who objected to backing around to the wagon pole, unable to open my eyes and hardly able to breathe. We all piled into the wagon. The excited horses were willing to travel with their backs to the wind. There was a track to follow, but its edges were already rounding full of sand. If the storm should continue long enough, it would be smoothed out. The Worrier's hope was justified, for at the end of 3 or 4 miles the wind seemed much less furious. We were among the dunes and found a fairly quiet little gully, full of deep sand as fine and soft as the sand on a beach. Something in the set of the wind through the mountains left this oasis of peace. We were even able to cook the long-delayed dinner. We did it by moonlight, slowly and carefully handling things and keeping them covered as much as possible, like having a picnic on a windy seashore. The Worrier suggested that we climb to the top of the dune which partially sheltered us, if we wanted to see what a sandstorm looked like. We did so. From that vantage point of comparative calm, we saw the whole Mesquite Valley filled with a dense yellow cloud that completely shut out the surrounding mountains, rising higher than they, swirling at the top like smoke ascending into the dark night sky. In the morning we climbed the dune again and looked across over the others. The blowing sand was less dense and we could see them all. Old Johnny had been right, they were 100 feet high. Their shapes were very beautiful, with knife-edge tops ridged in pure, clean lines, from which fringes of fine sand blew up like the wind-tossed manes of white horses. The masses and outlines of the dunes suggested Egyptian architecture. The pyramids and the crouching sphinx were there. Sand dunes must have been familiar to the Egyptians dwelling beside the Sahara. What is the huge sphinx, brooding and massive, gazing with strong eyes across the emptiness, but an interpretation of the desert carved in stone? We reached Salt Creek early and spent the rest of the day there. The wind continued to blow, the sand still swirled off the dunes, and the yellow dust cloud still obscured the mountains, but we were in the shelter of Tucki and the ground was so stony that we were not much troubled by the migrating sand. Once more Charlotte and I climbed the ridge from which we had watched the Worrier's remarkable hunting. The whole big basin of Death Valley between its high walls of rock was blurred with dust. Clouds of sand with wind-frayed edges rose into the sky. Not a gleam of radiance showed through. The green and white snake of Salt Creek coiled sullenly among the sulphur-colored hills. Only the blue eye was bright, poisonous, unwinking. The fair water that was too polluted for human drinking seemed to mock us. We waited for the enchanter to come at sunset, but as the day merged into evening the scene became inexpressibly dreadful. Suddenly Charlotte arose from the rock on which we were sitting. "Let us go," she whispered, and without further comment we hurried back to camp and made the Worrier collect enough wood from the swamp for a truly cheerful fire. The following day we traveled once more up the long northern mesa of Death Valley, but by a different route from that by which we had descended. This way was shorter, avoiding the long pull across the valley, though it was rockier, steeper, and cut by more islands of hills to cross or go around than the other. In many places the road vanished utterly, and only a desert rat could have piloted a wagon safely to its destination over that maze of ridges and gullies. The day was fine. At last the wind had died down and the dust clouds were slowly subsiding. Both Death Valley and the Mesquite Valley were veiled in heavy haze, but the brightness of their changing color now shimmered through. All day the white blaze of the sun was around us, and the silence, after a week of tumultuous wind, was a mighty dreaming. It was the living silence which we had first known on the night when we wandered away from Silver Lake, the silence in which the earth moves. The mountains dwelt in it majestically. Mojave was again making her fine gesture, unconscious of the discomforts and terrors of small living things. Her pointing at the far-off shining is always a conquest of grimness, as though sorrow were a stepping stone to beauty. By the out-jutting cliff of Daylight Pass, from which we had first beheld Death Valley, we made a long stop. Familiarity had only enhanced its splendor. With different eyes we saw the shining floor, the sad funeral mountains, the calm white curves of the high Panamints. What had been a picture was now a living experience. The rose and silver shifting over the white valley floor had new meaning. We knew that floor, we knew the feel of it, and its ever-changing beauty was a miracle. We were justified in the pilgrimage, for only by going thus to the White Heart, making stones and brush and jagged rocks our companions, depending on the springs to keep us alive and the roots of the greasewood to warm us, could we have known what a miracle it was. The words terror and beauty, which we had spoken during the first look down into the valley, and had thought that we understood, had real content now. We knew that they belonged together and that the one covered the other and changed its meaning. Chapter 12. The End of the Adventure. It was April when we returned to Silver Lake. Spring was walking on the desert. The sand and the stony mesas were decked with flowers. Great patches of California poppies bent on hair-like invisible stems before the wind, little floating golden cups. Blue lupins like spires of larkspur glistened in the sun. A four-petaled waxy flower with a shining satiny texture spread its masses on the sand. Daisies with yellow centers and lavender petals clustered beside rocks. A little plant like the beginnings of a wild rose tossed tiny pink balloons in the air. The shoots of the purple verbena ran over the ground, sending up little stems to hold its many floreted crowns. Even the thorny cactus bloomed with a crimson poppy-shaped flower. When we went on excursions to the mountains, the bayonet leaves of the yucca guarded tall spikes which bore aloft white shining blossoms, and the grotesque branches of the Joshua palms were tipped with brightness like lighted candles. Everywhere high clumps of yellow coreopsis rivaled the sun. Beyond the dry lake at the base of the sand ridge, which had been so terrifying on our first drive through the desert, stood stately Easter lilies hung with great white bells. Easter morning we went over there and gathered armfuls for our kind German hosts. Their house and ours were abloom during our stay, for we could no more resist gathering these amazing flowers than we could resist picking up the many-colored stones. Every dish and bowl was full, and tin cans, rescued from the dump, were promoted to be vases. The gallant little flowers in such a stern environment! They were touchingly lovely, blooming wherever they had the smallest chance and looking trustingly at the sun. It was as though we had never seen flowers before, never really seen them. Indeed, until we went on pilgrimage to the White Heart, we had never seen the outdoors, never really seen it. How could we not see it when the outdoors is always at the doorstep? We had thought we saw it. We had talked about it, a place for pleasant dalliance when work inside the walls was done, or a sort of glorified gymnasium to make the blood race and the heart beat faster. The outdoors is the awe-full, magnificent universe moving along, inexpressibly fearful and beautiful. And we might have seen it anywhere. The drama is always going on with its terror and beauty. The gentlest countryside is a part of it. Everywhere the grim touches hands with the fair. Storm alternates with calm, flowers grow out of death, and the fairness, the calm, and the flowers are the stronger. Poets and artists know this when they step across their thresholds in the morning, whence their unreasonable joy at being alive. But most of us have to be shaken awake before we can see what is in front of our eyes. The desert shook us awake. We had come looking for mysteries and terrible fascinations, and found only the mystery of the old outdoors and the terrible fascination of the old outdoors. Beauty pressing around sorrow, the desert is simply a very forceful statement about that. For the adventure with the outdoors is the adventure with beauty. And when you have that adventure, the jealous walls, however engrossing their contents, and they may be very interesting and amusing and serious and exciting, can never bully you again. They have doors and windows in them, and beauty is around them like a garment. You and I, unaccountably split off from the vast drama, and blessedly able to be aware of it for a little while, shall we let the din and bother inside the walls, the frantic lunging at the still face of time, raise such a dust in our eyes that we cannot see? Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all ye know on earth, and all ye need to know. Every day while we rested at Silver Lake we looked the length of the barren lake bed to the bright mirage at the base of the black mountain that was no mountain at all, and northward over sandy emptiness to the enchanted pathway leading behind the Avawatz. 14 of the still bright days of the desert were strung on the endless string before we had to say good-bye to our hosts and to the Worrier. Never can we forget any of the people whom we met during our adventure with the outdoors. Neither the few whom we have mentioned in this inadequate telling of it, nor the many whom we have not. They were all unfailingly kind. It was very hard to part from our guide, and nothing reconciled us to it except his cheerful promise to act as official Worrier again. Our hostess invited us to come any time and stay as long as we liked, an invitation of which we have gladly availed ourselves. We piled our baggage into the automobile, abandoned so long at Silver Lake, and through a whole sunny day drove away from the White Heart. The dim road led past sinister little craters that long ago spilled ugly black lava over the hills, through acres and acres of blue lupins blown to waves like a sea, across 2 ranges of enchanted mountains, and down into and over the white Ivanpah Valley, where the heavy sand made the engine boil. Several times we left the car to walk up the savage, torn-up hills, made gentle by flowers. When the noise of the engine was hushed, the silence was full of the singing of birds. In the rose and orange of evening we reached Needles on the bank of the red Colorado River, and came out of the wild and lonely place onto the great highway that joins the Atlantic and the Pacific. The sand and rock trail follows the steel road of the Santa Fe. Transcontinental trains roar past, and pennants flutter on automobiles from Maine and Florida, Michigan and Texas, Oregon and California. Dust clouds roll over the edge of Mojave as America goes by. Some travelers look at her curiously, some look longingly, some shudder, some pass with the window shades pulled down. All the time she is singing on her rosy mountain tops and in her deep, hot valleys where the blaze of the sun is white. End of Section 12. End of The White Heart of Mojave by Edna Brush Perkins.